My name is Mindy Romero, and I direct the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC. And on behalf of my center and the USC Price School of Public Policy, I want to welcome everyone to Every Vote Counts: What's Next After the 2020 Election. So today is part 4 to 2020's Record Voter Turnout. Is this the new norm? For those of you that might not be aware, this is again, fourth in a series, the other topics, and you can go to our websites to be able to find them there to see the recordings. But the other topics included lessons learned coming out of the 2020 general election, lessons like outreach and mobilization efforts, peaceful transition of power, that was in December. And then just on January 7th, the third in our series was on the topic of polarization in the US. You see there on your screen a list of our distinguished panelists. Want to just highlight the QR code there. In a moment, I will be introducing everyone, but please see the QR code for an extended version of their bios that you can access. You can obviously scan it with your camera phone, and you can access it at any time. So as we progress today, I'm going to first start off by introducing our panelists, and then I'm going to give a brief presentation on that record voter turnout, and then we'll transition into our panel discussion itself. So California Secretary of State Shirley Weber, our new Secretary of State, we're all very excited to have her here today, just sworn in the other day by California's Governor Gavin Newsom. Secretary Weber was nominated to serve as California Secretary of State by Gavin Newsom on December 22nd, 2020. Sworn into office on January 29th, and she is California's first Black Secretary of State and only the 5th African-American to serve as a constitutional officer in California's 170-year history. Secretary Weber was born to sharecroppers in Hope, Arkansas during the segregationist Jim Crow era. Her father, who left Arkansas after being threatened by a lynch mob, did not have the opportunity to vote until he was in his 30s. Her grandfather never voted as a custom and law in the South before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, systematically suppressed, of course, voting for Blacks. Although her family moved to California when she was quite young, 3 years old, it was her family's experience in the Jim Crow South that's driven her activism and legislative work. She has fought to secure and expand civil rights for all Californians, including restoring voting rights for individuals who completed their prison term. Secretary Weber attended the University of California, Los Angeles, where she received her BA, MA, and PhD by the age of 26, quite impressive. Prior to her doctorate, she became a professor at San Diego State University, SDSU, at the age of 23. She also taught at California State University, Los Angeles and Los Angeles City College before coming to SDSU. She retired from the Department of Africana Studies after 40 years as a faculty member and serving several terms as department chair. Before her appointment, Secretary Weber served 4 terms as an assembly member, representing California's 79th Assembly District, which includes part of the city of San Diego, as well as several cities in the San Diego region. Weber also served as a member and chair of the San Diego Unified School District and twice served as California elector, including chairing just recently the California College of Presidential Electors on December 14th, 2020. And I'll add, if I may, also just a few years ago, chairing the Assembly Elections Committee as well. So again, her extended bio is available on that QR code. So welcome, Secretary Weber. I'm going to give an introduction to our other 2 panelists as well. So Dr. Bernard Froga, Associate Professor at Emory University. His research interests are in the area of American electoral politics, racial and ethnic politics, and political behavior. Broadly, he studies how group identities and electoral contexts impact individual political behavior. Professor Fraga's methodology tends towards the statistical analysis of observational large data associated with voter registration records, and election results. He also conducts research on election law and electoral institutions in the US. And Professor Fraga teaches graduate and undergraduate courses on American elections, racial ethnic politics in the United States, and political science research methods. Welcome, Dr. Fraga. Thank you for joining us. And our next panelist, as an introduction, many here at USC will find him familiar, Dan Schnur. Dan Schnur is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley's Institute of California Studies, Pepperdine University's Graduate School of Public Policy, and of course, the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communications, where he teaches courses in politics, communication, leadership. Dan has also taught at the John F. Kennedy School of Government's Institute of Politics at Harvard University and George Washington's University Graduate School of Political Management. He was the founder of the USC LA Times statewide political poll, currently hosts a webinar for the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall called Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. I'll repeat that, you should check it out, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. And previously, Dan worked on four presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns as one of California's, of course, leading political strategists. He served as the National Director of Communications for the 2000 presidential campaign and campaign of U.S. Senator John McCain, and was the chief media spokesperson, if you didn't know, for California Governor Pete Wilson. Welcome, Dan. Thank you very much for joining us. Yes. So I am going to set the stage a little bit for us and give a brief data presentation. We're talking about this high turnout that we saw in 2020 in the general election. Let me give you some actual numbers around that. I'm going to briefly talk about the U.S., largely focusing on some brand new data around California. But I know that when we turn to our panel and specifically to Dr. Fraga, he's going to also touch on the Senate runoff election results there, as he has been tracking and following that famously on Twitter. So let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm just going to give you some simple numbers that set the stage, as I mentioned. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for our panelists. So again, we say record high turnout, and that's how the election has been framed. We should really say historically high turnout. So we do know that certainly we saw record early turnout and numbers around vote by mail use that we haven't seen before in this country. So that all is very new patterns of voter behavior that really, in some cases, just really flipped our understanding of political behavior or what typically would be our expectations in a general election. But the number itself, that turnout number was 66.7%. And let me also just define this. So when we say eligible voter turnout, usually there's 2 measures of turnout: registered voter turnout and eligible voter turnout. Eligible voter turnout is simply the percent of those that are eligible to vote in a given jurisdiction. In this case, we're talking about the US. These are numbers from the US Elections Project. So it's everyone that's age eligible adult citizens who are not barred or restricted from voting because of felony restrictions in their own state or because of mental capacity, things like that. So 66.7% of eligible voters voted in the US. That is the highest that we've seen since 1900. That's why we say historically high, but not a record. Of course, there is a large difference in terms of who was eligible to vote in the United States. Whole swaths, huge chunks of our country and of our population that were not eligible to vote, whose vote or right to vote was suppressed until the Voting Rights Act, and really for decades after in many, many different ways, right? If you want to compare it to the most recent general presidential election, 2016, about 6 percentage points higher. So when we're talking about kind of apples to apples, the same kinds of elections, presidential to presidential, midterm to midterm, we don't actually have a huge range in terms of low to high turnout. And here, as you see, historically high at 66.7%. That may surprise some of you because that means that about, roughly 35% or so of 34% or so of the eligible voter population in the US still didn't turn out to vote, even given the what I think by all accounts, right, is seen as a highly salient, highly consequential election, regardless of your political affiliation. Of course, there are very real reasons for why we don't see 100%, and some of that we will talk about today. Real barriers to participation, particularly around race, ethnicity, age, income, educational status, and so forth. So let me talk about California. As I said, I have some new data here. So first off, let's just present, if you haven't heard, the official numbers from the Secretary of State's office. 70.9% of the eligible voter turnout. That's the highest since 1952, eligible turnout since 1952's general election. Exciting, made headlines, and it's something that we should celebrate, absolutely. As researchers, we typically don't see big jumps, right, in turnout. So when we see a big jump like this is significant for a multitude of reasons. But I want to talk about disparity. So we keep that in play because there is much work to do still. And if we only celebrate the high turnout, and we want to talk about how we can continue that turnout today, is it the new norm? How can we make it the new norm? We also, of course, have to realize the work that we still have to do in that conversation, keeping that front and center. So we've done some just hot off the presses, some crunching of the data for California. We have not published this yet. This is still preliminary, but next week we'll begin to put out some fact sheets. But just at a basic level, using PDI, political data, incorporated data, and in a few slides also using some statewide database data, California Department of Finance data. For us, our eligible voter turnout number, percentage of those that are eligible to vote, our denominator is a little bit different. It's just adult citizens, and it's 67.4%. Very normal for researchers, their turnout numbers to be slightly different than an official number from the Secretary of State for lots of reasons. So ours is 67%, in the ballpark, close to what is the official number from the Secretary of State. But if we just stay within that, apples to apples, for Latinos, the turnout was 53%. Again, eligible, of those that are eligible to 53%. For Asian American, 47%. For youth, as we define age 18 to 24, 47%. We don't have, unfortunately, right now with this early data set, reliable data for whites and Black voters, at least that we can responsibly use for research purposes. There will be additional data sources that'll be available, one, for instance, from the current population survey that has self-reported race and ethnicity. But for right now, we're limited here just to be responsible as researchers. So let me just show you visualized what that looks like. So the same numbers I just gave you there on the far right, 2020, there's at 67% for everybody, 53% for Latinos, 47% for Asian Americans. I want to just take you back and show you, we don't have to get into the details of these numbers at all, but just to emphasize that disparities in turnout, whether it's a high turnout year, a low turnout year, a general, a midterm, they are ever present and they are entrenched, right? Let's move my screen here so I can see a little better. There we go. Now, turnout disparities have real consequences for the makeup of the actual electorate. Those who are actually deciding on races like the president and local, state and local races, and of course, a myriad of policies that matter for people's lives. So those disparities in turnout rates that I just showed you mean that, and we'll just focus here on the data that we do have for Latinos and Asian Americans, they continue to be underrepresented in California's voting electorate among those that are actually voting. I have to note that, of course, Blacks were also historically and still today underrepresented in California's electorate across the country. It does vary a little bit more for African Americans depending on the type of election, which I could talk about in Q&A if folks are interested, but they still are also underrepresented. Again, I'm just not showing that because I don't have that data. So want to make sure that that's an important note that everybody catches. So the turnout rates that I showed you equated to Latinos equaling 24% of actual voters casting a ballot in the November general election. But they're 31% of the eligible voter population. I mean, Asian Americans were 10% of actual voters, but they're almost 15% of the eligible voter population. For a group to be numerically represented amongst voters, their share of the actual pie of voters in any given election should be about the share of their eligible voter population. It never is, right? For African Americans, for Asians, for Latinos, or almost never is for Blacks. So underrepresentation. So this is just visualizing what I just mentioned, just to show you that. And let me, though, show you some really interesting news, though, over time. So if we look at the share of the vote over time for both of these groups, the red is Latino. You can see from 2002, and this is as far back as we go, 13.4% of all actual voters casting a ballot in that general election to 24% in the 2020 general election. Asian Americans from 5% to 10%. Now, both of these groups, which is different than African Americans and whites, have seen substantial growth in their share of the population as well as the eligible voter population. So, that is a driving factor for their overall increase in the share of the vote. But still, we see for both of these groups, historically high share of the vote, as you see from 2016 up 2 percentage points for both of these groups. That's a huge jump. And it means that these groups became a little bit more represented. The gaps closed a little bit in 2020, which is something we should acknowledge, but of course didn't completely. And then just quickly, they were 10% with their lower turnout rates, 20% of all actual voters, but 14.5% of the eligible voter population. So of course they also are historically underrepresented, but gained a little bit of ground as well in this recent election. So why disparities in turnout? Just one quick slide here, and then I'll turn it over to our panelist. Again, lots of things that we'll talk about today that are important very much going forward to think about that possibility of the new norm. But one thing I just want to highlight here, since we're talking about data and new data that we have, is registration rates. So we've also heard a lot, which we should be talking about, this historically high registration rate going into the November general election. 88%, right? That's the highest record number of folks that were registered, and the highest number in terms of a registration rate. And by the way, that's the percent of those that are eligible to vote that are actually registered to vote. Highest percentage, right, going into a general election in the past 80 years, something to celebrate. But if we look again and here I'm just stick with Latino and Asian American, it's also much younger for youth, much lower for youth, and typically also for African American. But we can see here our registration rate in 2020 on the far right, it's a little bit lower than the state's number, but it's 84%. For Latinos going into the general election in 2020, it was 73%, Asian Americans, 59%. If you're curious, young people, just under 60%. And again, that story of disparities in registration rates, even when the numbers have gotten really high, the disparities between groups are fairly steady. Right, so the gaps are still present. Everybody's going higher, but the gaps aren't closing to any significant degree. So again, work to be done there. So I want to take us into our panel. So up first, of course, is our new California Secretary of State, Shirley Weber. Thank you again very much for joining us, Secretary. And you have the first question of the afternoon. I ran through your bio, but of course, many people are familiar with you in lots of different ways and all the different types of work that you've done. But you're new to many people in the role of Secretary of State, and so if you could please just talk a little bit about what your top priorities are going to be as California's Secretary of State.
Well, clearly, thank you very much for the invitation, and sorry about the mix-up in terms of getting online. We're in the transition between the Assembly information and data and emails and Secretary of State, so sometimes those things don't always mesh. I've spent a significant amount of my time, obviously, dealing with the issue of social justice, and voting is one of those issues, and serving on various committees, and concerned about the fact that there are large numbers of people in California, particularly those of color, who do not vote. And there are a number of barriers to them being registered to vote and them voting, and a lot of misinformation concerning who can and cannot vote in California. And so a significant part of my first pieces of legislation before I became famous for all the police stuff was really around the issue of defining and helping people to understand and requiring people in the probation departments and the parole departments and as well as in our county jails to inform people that they had the right to vote. And giving them information and registering people to vote, because most folks thought if you committed a felony, you could never vote again. I mean, this was the mantra among lots of folks. And so we saw very low registration rates in African-American communities. People didn't want to talk about the fact that they couldn't register to vote in their own mind, but reality was they could. And so we began to work with churches and other groups as we created legislation to get the information out that yes, you can vote. And it became very apparent to me when I was campaigning for the legislature, that one man who volunteered, every day and said to me at the end, gee, in my whole life, I wish I could vote. And I asked him why. He said, I'm an ex-felon, had been out of jail for over 15 years, off parole, the whole bit, and thought he could never vote again. And so we began the process of working with the Secretary of State, working with parole and probation and those kinds of things that make it possible. So voting is extremely important. And there are a number of barriers that exist for people that prevent them from registering to vote. Mostly their own barriers that they've created in terms of wondering what kind of roles are kept on individuals. Can people be tracked and traced? All those kinds of things. And people who kind of feel like they live under the radar do not want to basically be registered to vote. So I've spent a significant amount of my time realizing that. I also, as a school board member, realized that if you don't register to vote and you don't participate in the process ignores you. And I saw that in terms of school board races. I'd be sitting on the school board arguing for something that was very, very important to Black and brown communities. And my fellow colleagues would kind of give it a tacit look, but not really seriously take it in. And as soon as someone from an affluent community showed up and raised some minor issues, those things were jumped on and addressed immediately. Why? Because those people vote and hold people accountable. And so it became real clear to me that that 5 out of 5 voter number that you hear as a campaign person, that person who goes to vote no matter what is a valuable person in the community. And so I began the whole campaign and trying to teach my folks how to understand why voting is important, not only for looking at the jury pools and those kinds of things, but equally important that people don't pay you attention when you don't vote. So we spent a significant amount of time trying to convince folks that they had the right to vote. And not only that we need to register them, but on the day of elections, we need to get them to the polls. And so I think this last turnout was really an example of people working to get not only people registered, but to get them to the polls, to create some environment that was much more conducive for people to vote. And COVID became the medium for which we began to put in place a number of things that we had worked on for years at the state level, but could never get as a mandate for every jurisdiction to have, whether it's everybody getting a ballot by mail, having voting centers, having multiple days to vote, on and on and on, became an option for some places rather than a requirement. And I think COVID, with all of its unfortunate things, was one of the ways of doing that. And we saw this not only here, but across the nation. I just got off a conference with the National Association of Secretaries of State, and all of them talked about the fact that under COVID, they were able to do some things that they had tried to do legislatively, but could never get passed. But when COVID happened, they got a chance to do it, and people began to realize that these things are safe and can be implemented to the benefit of the people who they work for.
Thank you very much. Most county elections offices see their responsibility as administering election, which it is, running a safe, secure election, servicing the needs of voters, that sort of thing. They don't necessarily see their main job as increasing voter turnout or limiting disparities in turnout. What do you think about this? Do you think that should change? And if so, what do you see your role or your office's role in that potential change?
This is for whom?
This is for the fact that election officials often.
This is for me. Question.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, still you.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. There's no question that one of the challenges that we have, and interestingly enough, a lot of our registrar voters at the local level are appointed by their board of supervisors, which means sometimes they have some limitations in how far they can go because they serve at the pleasure of, and depending on the politics of the board of supervisors will sometimes determine what happens in those cases. And so they feel that they're limited, yes, but at the same time, they should be able to address either to their board or to the legislature, things that they see that are clearly barriers to people's ability to vote, whether they may not have the authority in all cases to change them, but surely they should be able to make recommendations to the legislature. And it is a responsibility of the legislature to, when we see those barriers, as it is the responsibility of the federal government when we see barriers that prevent people from registering or prevent them from basically showing up at polls or having some sense of a number of polling places that make it convenient for people to participate. It is their responsibility to try to implement a fair, just, safe voting environment that is fair and just to everyone that is trying to vote, regardless of whether it's Democrat or Republican. But that can be difficult, a difficult needle for them to thread in the environment in which they've been appointed. And a significant number of our registrar of votes basically are appointed. And many of our secretaries of states across the nation are appointed and not elected officials. So they have a tendency, they're much more muted in terms of areas, depending on the politics of the persons who appoint them. And therefore, they see themselves really as just implementing the voting roles that are there. We've had some who've been a little bit more aggressive and involved, who want to basically make recommendations and should, and some will participate in legislation that we've authored over the years. We'll have sometimes a registrar voter who will participate. We have also seen registrar voters who blocked things like recounts and made it more difficult for, depending on their own politics, to do things. And as a result, the Secretary of State and others and the Attorney General have to intervene to make sure that there's some justice and fairness even in the recount situation that's there. So ultimately, the Attorney General and the Secretaries of State have the responsibility to ensure that our voting system is fair and just. We hope that our registrar of voters will assist and participate in that. But depending on sometimes the way in which they're appointed will determine whether or not they feel that it's their responsibility or in the best interest of their security, I guess one would say, to basically participate in opening up the roles and making sure that there's a fairness and a just system that's there.
Any first plans, just to follow up to that, if I may, Secretary Weber, any first plans or thoughts on how your office can encourage that change, even with some of the barriers that you just mentioned that election officials are facing?
Well, no question that, unfortunately, I haven't had a chance in the last 3 days to meet with all of my registrar of voters, but that's on my agenda for calendar meeting. And unfortunately won't be able to do it in person, but virtually. Want to figure out what the barrier, make sure that they understand the laws that they have the responsibility to implement, and the new laws that come out each time. Sometimes it's depending on the jurisdiction, especially if it's small and it's just one person, one in an office with just a little bit of staff, you have a lot less willingness to move forward and to basically challenge some things or to look at things that need to be looked at. And so my task would be to make sure that every registrar voter has kind of support that they need to understand what their roles and responsibilities are, to understand what some of the barriers are that they may see, and to respond to the barriers that some of the public has identified as some barriers to them having a fair and just election. Oftentimes these things are common sense things if you're on the outside looking in, but if you're on the inside and this is how you've always done something, it may not necessarily look like the thing to do. To try to provide them with as much research and information as we possibly can, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about voting and voting security and all those kinds of things. And so this year, I will be increasing the persons in our office whose responsibility is to clarify information, to make sure that we use whatever social media platform as well as other platforms to get the correct information out. That when we hear rumors about fraud and this, that we're able to respond very quickly because we saw most recently the devastating impact of allowing misinformation to continue to grow and to fester. It does not go away on its own, it explodes. And so we want to make sure that those things don't happen. And so we're going to have a very aggressive team that will be looking at all of the misinformation that comes out concerning voting in California and making sure that we're giving people the right information, making sure we're using all of our support systems to get that information out, regardless across parties, as well as town halls and things of that nature. When we hear misinformation, it's extremely important that we respond to it.
Thank you very much. And I realize that we are catching you early into your tenure. And I appreciate you giving us your first thoughts on that. Okay, so I'm going to turn over to our other panelists for a moment. Bernard, first to you, or Dr. Fraga, excuse me, first to you. What are some of the factors that explain the high turnout that we've seen in 2020 in the general? And also, as you can speak to it, the resulting runoff in Georgia and the high turnout there.
Sure. So thanks so much for having me on and for inviting me to be part of this important panel and celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the Center for Inclusive Democracy. It's also an honor to be on a panel with the new California Secretary of State, Secretary Weber. Thank you so much for your comments and for your leadership over the years and for the leadership that is to come, that is very much needed in California and hopefully using California as a model for other states. So when we think about the high turnout that we saw in this most recent November election nationwide, to keep two things in mind. First of all, before the COVID-19 pandemic, it was very clear, all surveys suggested that Americans were highly, highly engaged in the presidential election. They knew what was at stake. They were very interested, had very strong feelings about Joe Biden, about the Democratic candidates before him as well, and about President Trump. So we knew that turnout and enthusiasm would be high, repeating what we saw in 2018, where we also saw record turnout, at least for recent decades, record turnout in a midterm. However, the other factor that we have to understand, and we're now interpreting because we have the good data on it, is the fact that voting was easier than it ever has been before. As a result of the pandemic, in some ways, but also as a result of the expansion of access to the ballot in many states, we saw an increase in vote by mail. We saw an easing of the registration process in some states as well, including pre-registration and automatic or automated voter registration implemented in many states. And although turnout went up in states all across the nation, almost every single state had a decades record for voter turnout this year in November, we saw a larger increase in turnout on average in states that switched to an all-mail ballot system, in states that increased voting access, and that ensured that everyone who wanted to cast a ballot could cast a ballot, at least to the extent possible. Now, I'm speaking to you from Atlanta, Georgia, from the campus of Emory University, John Lewis's old district, Georgia District 5. And this is a district that I think understands the power of the vote. I think the state of Georgia now understands the power of the vote as well, because in the runoff elections, which only happened because of Georgia's kind of arcane runoff rules about needing a majority in order to take a statewide elected office, we saw record voter turnout by African-American voters, by Latinx and by Asian American voters, but primarily by African-American voters turning out to vote, record numbers for a runoff that ensured, right, Democratic victories. And I think, again, this speaks to the power of the vote and the fact that people knew what was at stake. Organizations came out, mobilized voters, and not just the 5 out of 5 kind of high propensity voters, but also lower propensity voters, lower income, younger minority voters, made sure that they understood what was at stake and turned them out to vote. So I think that when we talk about the combination of high salience and making sure that everyone has the opportunity to cast a ballot, it's very easy to see why we saw record turnout, not just in November across the country, not just in Georgia in the runoff, but we might see record turnout if it's sustained going forward as well.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Dan. Same question. What are some of the factors as you see them that explain the high turnout in 2020?
Well, I could save us a lot of time by just simply stating what he said and agreeing with everything that Dr. Fraga offered. But what I also want to do, because that would violate the first rule of panel discussions, is first I want to thank you, Mindy, for letting me join you. And also, having done these types of programs before at USC and elsewhere, want to take a moment to thank Harley and Katie and Corey and the rest of your tremendous team at the center for the work they do, not just on this program. They don't get nearly the glory that you do, Mindy, but I know they do great work and they deserve at least a shout out. And I want to join Dr. Fraga in not only congratulating Secretary Weber, but letting her know how enthusiastic and how excited so many of us are by the role she's now taken on. Secretary Weber, many of us admired and applauded the tremendous work that you did in the state legislature, and we'll be thrilled to see you continuing that work in this new office. Mindy, I think Bernie Froga talked very eloquently and accurately about the important role that increased voter access played in this election. In many states, of course, that was a direct result of the pandemic. But here in California, it's because we've taken aggressive steps over the years, long before any of us had ever heard of COVID-19, to make voting that much easier and that much more accessible for a large number of people. So part of it's the rules. You make it easier for people to vote and more people vote. No surprise there. The other factor we'd be remiss if we didn't mention, of course, was the presence of Donald Trump on the ballot. Donald Trump spent 4 years as our nation's commander-in-chief, but let's also agree he was the motivator-in-chief. And not only did he excite and inspire tremendous numbers of voters to turn out on his behalf in 2016 and 2020, he also excited and inspired even larger numbers of voters to turn out against his candidacy in 2020. So while hopefully we can, here in California and elsewhere, continue to expand access to voting for all the reasons that Dr. Fraga mentioned, I think one of the challenges we'll face in 2024 is it's unlikely, no disrespect to President Biden or his Republican opponent, but it's unlikely we're going to see a figure on the national landscape in the short to midterm future who is going to motivate voters to turn out the way Donald Trump did. So I think that is the other reason, in addition to the overview that Dr. Fraga provided. The one other thing I'll mention briefly, and perhaps we can come back to it, and you alluded to this too, Mindy, as did Secretary Weber, is even while we celebrate the tremendous increase in voting here in this state and across the country in 2020, it's even more important to recognize how many people still did not vote. And there's a considerable amount of research that's been done that shows the single most reliable indicator on whether a young person will vote when they turn 18 years old is if they grew up in a household in which there was at least one registered and regular voter. And so for that very large number of Californians who grew up in a house in which there was no adult voting, or in many households where there was no adult eligible to vote, someone has to step into that gap. And Secretary Weber, if I can be so presumptuous, now that you've had all of 72 hours in your new job, the one thing I'd humbly request that you add to your to-do list is to join the efforts that have already begun in California at USC and elsewhere to increase the level of civics education required in California high schools. In other words, if a young person is not going to get that information at home through no fault of their parents because it's not available, they don't get it at home, they're not going to get it on the streets. And the fact that most California high schools require one single semester of civics, 15 weeks of civics and government and geography, all crammed in to one semester in 11th or 12th grade, I worry greatly that the message that we're sending to our next generation of leaders is that this politics stuff, this democracy stuff is so unimportant, we're not going to bother to talk to you about it for your first 10 years of school. But then we want you to turn around 18 months later and become a regular voter and a responsible citizen. And so one semester of civics at the tail end of a secondary school isn't enough. The sooner we start, the better. And I think ultimately in the long run, that's the way you boost these numbers even higher.
Thank you, Dan. You actually transitioned a little bit into our next set of questions. So I want to make sure we have some time, at least at the end. I know we started a little late, but some time for questions. So let's combine a couple of things here. So I'm going to ask each of you to talk about this, but maybe in a slightly different way. So Bernard, Dr. Froga, moving to our question, what do you think is the likelihood of seeing continued high turnout? As you talk about that, if you could talk about clearly some of the remaining barriers to turnout, why do we see these entrenched disparities in turnout by race, ethnicity, age, and so forth? And how does that factor into seeing continued high turnout? And I'll start with you, and then I'll move to Dan, and then of course let our Secretary Weber have the last word.
That's a great question. I think that's a question that everybody's asking right now. Are we going to see continued high levels of engagement? I think about this in two ways. First of all, yeah, sure. A rising tide lifts all boats, right? Turnout was up across the board. It was up for young people. It was up for older people. It was up for whites. It was up for non-whites. It was up across populations. And, lower propensity voters became a little bit more likely to vote. High propensity voters stayed very likely to vote. But to me, the disparities are really worth discussing because despite the fact that turnout increased 7 percentage points nationally, maybe more like 10 percentage points in California. And in Georgia, it's around 7 percentage points as well. We still saw 10 to 15 percentage point disparities between white and black turnout, 10 to 15 percentage point disparities between white and Asian American turnout in Georgia, and 20 to 30 percentage point disparities in the rate of voter turnout between whites and Latinos. Latinos, the largest minority group in the country, and a very fast growing population in Georgia, especially, that's exercising its political clout in a way we haven't seen before. So to me, I think the question going forward has to have two parts. One is, how can we make sure that the voters who already are turning out to vote continue voting? But what are we going to do? What's it going to take to tell voters who didn't vote in 2020, who didn't vote in a high stakes election, who maybe don't think that they should be voting in the future, don't even know that they can vote, as Secretary Weber mentioned, because they think felon disenfranchisement applies to them even though their state doesn't have the statutes in the same way as some others. How do we reach out to those voters? How do we create a more representative electorate, not just a high turnout electorate, but a more representative democracy by trying to narrow those gaps, those disparities in voter turnout? Those are the questions that I talk about a lot in my recent book. And frankly, I don't have a lot of great answers there other than to say this is a long-standing problem that's going to take more than just policy change, that frankly is going to take a change in the way we think about non-voters and approach them as not a problem, not people who are lazy, but instead people who need to be mobilized, engaged, and empowered by politicians, by candidates, and by the public, quite frankly.
It sounds like you're saying in an ongoing way beyond the context
Absolutely.
of the election that we just went through. Yeah. Thank you very
Yes.
much.
Thank you.
Dan, your thoughts. So again, what do you think is the likelihood that we're going to see continued high turnout?
Well, as I said a moment ago, I think continuing to expand access creates an opportunity for turnout to increase. But once again, the absence of a figure like Donald Trump on the ballot means in all likelihood in 2024, we will see a smaller turnout. And we shouldn't necessarily see that as a discouraging thing because this is a long-term challenge. We didn't get to this place in our democracy overnight. It took us a long time. It's going to take us a while to get out of it too. And so if you'll forgive me, Mindy, I'll go back to my point of civics education, and maybe I'll try to offer a bit of evidence on why I think an enhanced effort on educating not just high school students, but even elementary school students on the importance of community involvement and gradually leading into a discussion about voting responsibilities is so important. Many California high schools, as you know, and I know the Secretary knows, most California high schools require each student to complete a certain number of volunteer hours before they can be awarded with a diploma. Now, I like to make jokes about this because mandatory volunteerism is my second favorite oxymoron after jumbo shrimp, in case anyone was interested. But it works. By the time these young people get into my classrooms at USC and at Berkeley and at Pepperdine, they're no longer required to volunteer, but because these values were instilled in them in elementary school and in high school, when they're in college and it's not required anymore, they keep volunteering. And after they graduate from college and they acquire homes and families of their own, they keep volunteering because we instilled those values in them at a young age. And I can't help but think that if we make the same effort in impressing upon them the importance of participation in the formal political process, as opposed to other types of community involvement like volunteering, I can't help but to think that we'll see similar levels of success.
Thank you. So Secretary Weber, your thoughts. Again, the question is, what do you think is the likelihood of seeing continued high turnout? And of course, happy to have any thoughts you have in terms of any geography, but particularly in terms of the work that you have planned going forward for California. What do you see the likelihood is and maybe some of the challenges and opportunities, I guess, associated with that?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank the other panelists and obviously thank you as well for organizing this and this conversation that we're having. And I'm hoping that those who are on the panel will continue to stay in dialogue with me as we try to hopefully not only duplicate, but exceed what we have done. My goal is 100% participation. And I tell people that because if someone had gone to my mother, who was a mother of 8 children, and said, 7 of your kids or 6 of your kids can really read, and she would be furious because she said, what about the other 2? Being a good mother, is 80% is not sufficient. 75% is not sufficient. 100% of your kids should be functioning. And so I look at it in that way, that in this country, 100% of Americans should be functioning. And functioning means being politically engaged in terms of participating in the process, the electoral process that hopefully makes it possible for them to fashion an America and a California that we love. It's going to be a challenge because we don't have Donald Trump. I hope we don't have Donald Trump on the ballot in the next election, because that became the motivating factor for so many people. And I tried to tell people it's important that we do that because, finally people had a reason to vote. They believed that there were consequences for voting and not voting. I mean, before that, people felt like, whatever, we'll be okay. This is the United States. We won't have uprisings. There'll be a nice transition of power. People won't be mean to each other. And even though I don't agree with his philosophy and his politics, there's some good that still comes out of Republicans or Democrats or whatever it may be. And so folks have never been as motivated as they were this past election. And so, that was a driving force for so many people. We now have to create something different than just that. Not only do we have to put in place all of those things we know that will work, that will help, and that have been used in Colorado, whether it's vote by mail, whether it's the voting centers, with the various options and choices that people have, making it easier to register to vote through our motor voter bills and things like that. All those kinds of things are going to work. But we have to help people understand why they have to vote. And it's interesting that it was mentioned because one of the things I've talked about at the very beginning was the issue of civic education. I'm an educator to the core, to the heart. I mean, I believe that people do what they're taught to do, what has been taught for them to do. And the fact that I vote and my sisters and brothers vote is because we had a voting poll in our house, in our living room. That was the voting poll for 351 West 45th Street on 45th and Broadway. All the folks in that area voted at our house because our school could no longer accommodate voting because of breakfast and lunch programs in the school auditorium. So my mother, as a poll worker, volunteered that our house would be the place where people vote. It has a profound impact when you come home from school and middle school every day when voting seasons, and your dad has set up the booth and not in the garage, but in the living room. So you have to go through the back door and you see all the people voting. It says voting is very important. So important your family disrupts their life in order to be able to do it, and it has value. So I've been talking about civic education, and I know that we have a very weak civic education program in California. I've already been talking to some of the teacher groups, and I'm going to be meeting with our superintendent, because we have to help and start early to teach folks to believe in this country, to understand what democracy is, to understand how tolerance and participation is there. And without that, we see folks who don't understand. I mean, folks who are doing the things that they do now really do not understand what a democracy is, do not understand their participation in it and what needs to happen. And so we are seeing now, not just at the lower level, we're seeing it at the congressional level, people who don't understand their roles and responsibility as keepers of the democracy. I mean, people who believe silence is going to basically solve the problem, and it has not. And so I see this as much larger than just our folks who did show up to vote. It really is an American problem. And we've kind of hid it because we've been able to endure, because we have some good-hearted people who want to keep this democracy going. But we have now been faced with the monster that is there to help people to educate them and to understand what goes on. And so I want to engage in a very aggressive civic education program that is not just in high school, but in every elementary schools, where we have decathlons on civic education and competition and help people to understand, where we get young people engaged. When I first ran for the school board, the young people who helped me run for school board saw how hard it was to run a campaign. So how difficult it was and how hard it is to get just one vote to turn out. As a result, they are voters for life, because they know, go vote early so nobody have to keep calling you, because they had to keep calling people to say, have you gone 5 times, waiting for people to go to the polls. So now they go and they're the first ones there at 7 o'clock in the morning. because they know that's at least one person's energy that's not turned on them. And so it is really, really important that people don't understand the process, but once you understand it and you participate in it and you see the good that comes from it, once you lobby for a bill and you get members, people to vote for it, once you see the turnout, I mean, once I see young people turn out for the issues that I've been fighting for, they are ecstatic that we can actually bring change, that somebody's listening to them, that these things occur. And so I'm very adamant about the whole issue of civic education. I mean, I think we can do a lot of things at this level, but in the end, it is the individual who has to go and get up that morning and believe that it is their responsibility and their opportunity to basically cast their vote in order to shape the kind of a California, the kind of a United States they want. So it's interesting you mentioned civic education, because I've been talking about that with many of the reporters about what are we going to do? And I'm saying, we're going to try to educate Californians, because that's what we lack. I mean, when I've gone around the world and I see people wrapped around buildings just for the opportunity to vote, our kids need to understand the history of those who had lost their vote and lost their voice, so they realize how special and precious it is to have a voice. I recognize that because of my parents and my grandparents who were denied the opportunity to vote in Arkansas and suffered immensely from not being able to voice for themselves who they were, not being able to hold their own land in their own hands, and those kinds of things that were there. I understand we have to teach that to our young people. Young people need to understand just not only the correlation between the South, but the correlation in the relationship today. And so that's what I see as one of my challenges and one of the things I bring to this office. We've got a lot of good stuff going on, but my passion, my drive about education and training and inspiring people to understand just how fragile this democracy is and how we have to work so hard to protect it. And without it, it will crumble. And so that's my message to Californians, and that's what I hope we'll bring in my administration as a Secretary of State.
What she said.
Well, wow. So you know what, I think that, yes, I agree, Dan. I think that that's a great place to end. We're just about at time anyway. We're looking through the questions, and I think most of the questions that we have are ones that we typically, if we don't get to questions, we answer them offline. So we'll do that. But I think that's a really great place to end, Secretary Weber. Thank you so much. Since there has been so much conversation about civics, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that my center, along with, it's part of an initiative called YCYCI, it's Yolo County Civic Initiative, partners with the Yolo County Department of Ed and the Yolo County Elections Office. We've created a curriculum, a set of lessons plans that we're piloting right now in Yolo County with high school students. But there are lots of great efforts out there across the country as so many people come together to emphasize the importance of civics in our schools. Not the only solution, but a very important pathway, right? So everyone, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank our panelists, Dan Schnur, Professor Fraga, and again, of course, our new California Secretary, not new to California and not new to important good work, and just a long lifetime of impactful work and advocacy on behalf of California communities. I think we're all very fortunate and very thankful to have you in this role and excited to see what you do going forward as our new Secretary of State. Thank you very much for in these incredibly busy days to take time out to join us today and to let us hear your first thoughts in the role. So thank you so much, Secretary Weber.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This is recorded. This was also live on Facebook. Thank everybody that joined us on Facebook. The link will be sent out if you want to share it or look at it again later, and always available on our websites as part of the series. So thanks again.